Here was Barack Obama's promise regarding the federal budget.
Now, many of these plans will cost money, which is why I've laid out how I'll pay for every dime by closing corporate loopholes and tax havens that don't help America grow. But I will also go through the federal budget line by line, eliminating programs that no longer work and making the ones we do need work better and cost less, because we cannot meet 21st century challenges with a 20th century bureaucracy.
The Obama administration and the Democratic Congress' first act of this fiscal responsibility was to pass a $787 billion stimulus bill. It had to be passed before President's Weekend or the economy faced certain doom.
Well, it's a very short story. The president told the Democratic Congress he wanted to spend $1 trillion with interest. They agreed. They didn't even take the time to read the bill. They passed it into law.
But we have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
Flying Air Force One to New York City for a photo op, $328,000. Handing out 10,000 Social Security checks to people who are already dead, $2.5 million. Managing the odor of pigs, $1.7 million. Studying the genetic code of grapes, $2.1 million. Looking for space aliens, $9.4 million. Passing the stimulus bill, unread, $787 billion. There are some things that money can't buy. But for these and everything else, there's the federal government card.
And that is why the single most important part of this economic recovery and reinvestment plan is the fact that it will save or create up to 4 million jobs.
Broken down, that's $250,000 per job.
The stimulus plan is one of the great hoaxes of all time. It did not work. Government spending does not create jobs. It just creates debt, and it creates a lot of inflation, and that's what we're seeing right now. And so this $800 billion spending plan that Barack Obama and the Democrats passed in 2009 was a catastrophe. And now we face a situation where in 5 or 6 years, the single biggest item in the federal budget, bigger than Medicare, bigger than Social Security, bigger than national defense, interest payments on all of this debt. It's just paying the interest on the debt. I mean, this is craziness. It is fiscal child abuse.
Well, the stimulus money should be turned back to the American public in the form of tax cuts. As Ronald Reagan proved, that tax cuts is the way to stimulate the economy. It's the real way. It's not a cash for clunker program. That's not a way to really and truly stimulate the economy. It's cutting the wage earners' taxes, getting government off their back so they can purchase things, and the more they purchase, the more people work.
The president was quick to cast blame on his predecessor for the nation's mammoth $1 trillion plus deficit.
That's the story of the first 6 months. It's cost some money to do this. Although I've got to say, when I hear critics talk about out-of-control spending, I start scratching my head. I can't help but remember those same critics contributed to a $1.3 trillion deficit that I inherited when I took office. I mean, seriously. You know, I'm now president, so I'm responsible for solving it, but I do think we shouldn't have a selective memory in terms of spending habits. You hand me a $1.3 trillion bill, and then you're complaining 6 months later because we haven't paid it all back.
So he's complaining about the deficits, but then doubling them, and now with health care tripling, and has plans for unending deficits. That's the problem with it.
What's the true story behind the $1.4 trillion deficit Obama claims he inherited in 2009? Well, let's take a closer look at that. During President Bush's last full year in office in 2008, the federal deficit was $600 billion. Obama steps in and adds quite a bit to next year's budget. First, he and the Democratic Congress passed the stimulus bill, $787 billion, which $242 billion was spent in 2009. Subtract that from the $1.4 trillion, and you get a deficit of around $1.1 trillion. But the Democrats also passed a $410 billion omnibus spending bill. Oh yeah, take off $60 billion for the auto industry. Then there was the $8 billion expansion of the S-chip health insurance program, and another $3 billion for cash for clunkers. And I'm sure I did not find all the new spending, but it's clear that Bush did not leave President Obama a $1.4 trillion deficit. It looks like President Obama and the Democratic Congress more than doubled it. But then again, math was never his strong suit.
We've traveled to every corner of the United States. I've now been in 57 states. I think one left to go.
Nancy Pelosi seems even more out of touch with reality regarding the president and the budget.
Quite frankly, I think he's done excellently the first 100 days. Somebody asked me, what grade would you give him? I said, well, I would give him an A.
What planet is Pelosi on? A budget that reduces taxes, lowers the deficit, and creates jobs. This budget does just the opposite. I don't know. Maybe she was grading on a curve.
Tried to explain to my 8-year-old son the other day about how much is $1 trillion. So I asked him, I said, David, who's the greatest basketball player in the world? And he said, LeBron James. And so we looked it up and we found out that LeBron James makes $40 million a year to play basketball. And so then I asked him, how many seasons would LeBron James have to play basketball at $40 million a season to have $1 trillion? And you know what the answer is? 25,000 seasons. You know, these numbers are gigantic. $1 trillion is $1 million.
All of that comes out of the future earnings of our economy. We all know from our own experience that if you live beyond your means today, by necessity, you'll have to live below your means tomorrow. That's the tomorrow that we're creating for our nation.
That's exactly what we're doing with deficit spending. It's like we are going to the buffet and we are pigging out. And we're getting up and walking out the door without paying, and the next poor bunch of slobs who come through that door are not only going to have to pay for their food, they're going to have to pay for mine, and they didn't even get to eat mine. That's what deficit spending does, and it's, I think, immoral.